Good day. Thank you for joining this Teneo Insights Quick Take. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. At this time, on Wednesday, June 18th, the world awaits a decision by the President of the United States on whether he deems it necessary and in the interests of the United States to militarily enter the conflict between Israel and Iran that commenced last Friday, specifically to attack and neutralize critical elements of Iran's nuclear program, especially the facility at Fordo. Today, we focus on the military considerations, what U.S. military involvement would look like, how long it might last, what can be achieved, and importantly, risks to success in the mission. To do so, I'm joined by three colleagues. Melissa Dalton was the 28th Undersecretary of the Air Force. She is joined by General Mark Kelly. He's the former commander of Air Combat Command in the U.S. Air Force. And Ted Singer joins us. He's the former head of Middle East operations for the CIA and a five-time station chief. All three of them are principals with Teneo's strategic partner, WestExec advisor. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today on such short notice when there's a lot going on. And Ted, perhaps I can lean on you first here, given your extensive experience in the region. But perhaps for the audience, you can sort of set the stage a little bit, particularly on the target that seems to be everyone's focus for U.S. involvement, which is the facility at Fordo. Talk a little bit about what it is, what makes it so unique and special, and such a challenging target that it requires Israel to call the United States in, and what we don't really know about it, or what you think the mystery is there.
All right. Let me just reel back just about a year to set the stage. So when Israeli plans, which have been, worked and reworked over the past 20 years, their plans for an attack on Iran have had sort of four components. First and foremost was reducing or degrading or eliminating Hezbollah as an immediate threat to Israel. Box checked. Second was an ability to eliminate or degrade or render inoperable up to 90% of Iran's ability to launch missiles at Israel, specifically ballistic missiles. We're close to a check by most sort of open source reporting. They've hit somewhere about 50% of the launchers that are able to lob these missiles at Israel. Third pillar was basically U.S. air clearance for them to fly routes specifically over Iraq. And you really have a double check mark there because it appears that Israeli aircraft have been flying as well over Syria. So neither Iraq nor Syria necessarily has the air defense capability to prevent the Israelis from using some of those air routes. So sort of three of the box checks are there. The big fourth one, and that's what I think brings us together here, is Fordo. They require U.S. assistance to deliver some sort of knockout blow or to render this facility, which I'll describe a little bit, inoperable or inaccessible. Most of the open source information that's out there is actually documents that the Israeli Mossad themselves had stolen and published. A lot came out during the period of time when President Obama was negotiating JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran at the time. And when this facility, sort of what it is and what it was revealed, even the United States, the IAEA had declared it inconsistent with a peaceful nuclear program. So it is the Big Kahuna and a mystery wrapped in an enigma of Iran's nuclear program. It's situated oddly in the holy city of Qom, which for Iranian Shia is sort of their Mecca, for want of a better term. It is a fuel enrichment plant, and it is presumably, and I'm saying the word presumably, where Iran would be able to fabricate weapons grade uranium. Hence the deep concern of Israel that that is where Iran would get the appropriate material to build a nuclear bomb. There's somewhere estimated about 3,000 centrifuges in this facility, which is 80 to 90 meters underground, reinforced concrete, reinforced with steel. And again, I'll go back. The fourth leg of the Israeli military planning for Iran was the need for U.S. help to deliver the ordnance and to supply the aircraft that could deliver the ordnance that might be able to penetrate this facility.
And just to follow up on that, is it your there's been reports that, obviously the Iranians know that everybody knows what's at Fordo, essentially. So that they have dispersed some of that material and capability that you're talking about, perhaps to other undeclared sites, therefore further complicating the efforts of both Israel and potentially the United States at eliminating the nuclear program, or do we feel pretty confident about the concentration of what's there?
Well, I think we're talking two different things here, Kevin. So this particular facility, Fardo, destroying it, eliminating it, rendering it inoperable, and the Israelis have struck it already. So there are 5 tunnel entries going into this place, and the Israelis have been trying to sort of chip away at anybody's ability to enter this facility. I think we've all seen the reports of whether it's boots on the ground Israeli commandos or airstrikes also targeting some of the key personnel. So they're trying to do everything they can to render this thing inoperable as a location that can produce the weapons grade uranium. So eliminating that reduces or eliminates Iran's ability to produce that. Whether or not the Iranians have dispersed this to some of the 40 or so other nuclear locations around their country, I think hopefully our intelligence personnel around the world and the Israelis themselves are focusing on that particular quandary for with a laser-like focus.
Listen, let me bring you into the conversation here, because if the president has made a decision here, it has not yet been made public, but it would appear that military assets are in place should he give a green light, and presumably also it is a significant demonstration to Iranians about the seriousness of the situation. One final last opportunity for a diplomatic to sue for peace and take a diplomatic off ramp, perhaps. But assuming that, and so talk a little bit. I want to get in a minute to something you referenced in our earlier conversation, the sort of mythical massive ordnance penetrator, the MOP, if you will, the big bunker buster. We'll get to that in a second, but talk about the overall array of assets that are brought to bear, and the your sense of current preparation.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to weigh in with colleagues on this important issue. The president is contemplating taking some further steps to support Israel in its campaign in Iran that we've seen unfold over the last few days. The United States has been supporting Israel from a defensive posture to this point to protect U.S. forces in the region, in the Middle East, as well as to support Israel in defending against the barrage of missile attacks from Iran, that the counterstrike from Iran. There has been ample public reporting of the force deployments that the United States has made in the last 48 hours. What I believe we need to look for now are indicators of U.S. intent to further escalate its involvement and for the potential preparation of strikes in Iran to set the theater. So some of the things that we could see include the further reduction or restrictions on U.S. embassy civilian personnel in the Middle East. There already have been some steps taken in that regard, but to further bring down the numbers and exposure. We may also see evidence of coordination with U.S. allies and partners on the force protection measures and operational access points that would be required to take more of an offensive posture. And you might also see the pre-positioning of fighters, bombers, destroyers refueling, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities more broadly in Europe and in Diego Garcia to essentially be on standby to support Middle East operations and making that shift to a more offensive posture potentially. You mentioned the massive ordnance penetrator. Know that this is a subject of debate in the news cycle right now. U.S. support to Israel could include the employment of the MOP, the GBU 57 bomb. It's a 30,000-pound bomb on a US B-2 bomber that would provide a bunker busting capability to attack Iran's underground Fordo complex that Ted described. The key here is how does that link to the overall US and Israeli approach for the nuclear negotiations and the campaign that Israel has been prosecuting? What are the overall objectives from a diplomatic perspective and then from a security perspective? And how does that then translate into what the approach for Fordo would be? I say that because while the MOP does provide that bunker busting capability, depending what the objectives are, it may be that the United States and Israel need a mix of capabilities to achieve the objectives that they share. That could include multiple strikes on Fordo. It may include multiple MOPs. It could include other types of ordnance, including ordnance and munitions that the Israelis are capable of carrying. It could also include potential unconventional methods of attack, such as through cyber means, to disrupt the operations at Fordo. But it really depends on what the objectives are militarily that are defined by the United States and hopefully agreed to by Israel. There may be some differences there too in terms of what the Israelis want and what the U.S. is willing to contribute. This would obviously be a significant escalation for the United States to become directly involved from an offensive perspective and would put the United States squarely into direct conflict with the state of Iran. Why does that matter? And what is on the minds of senior defense civilian officials in the Department of Defense right now? Ted mentioned that Israel has been successful in eroding the so-called axis of resistance network of Iranian proxies over the last 2 years in Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and the West Bank, reducing some of that deterrent effect for the U.S. and Israel. We've also seen Israel's successful campaign over the last few days to take out other Iranian key leadership and some of their missile capabilities. So the threats to an immediate U.S. action, such as at Fordo, may be diminished in that sense in terms of those two vectors. But there are still formidable risks to the United States in taking this step that are being unlikely or likely debated right now that could embroil the United States and its allies and partners in a broader conflict. That could include attacks on U.S. forces in the region from Iran, from the remaining proxy forces that still exist, and or from the Houthis in Yemen. We could see Iran take steps to close or restrict access to the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea, impacting commercial shipping globally. We could see Iran take steps to mount cyber attacks on military or civilian infrastructure in the region, or vulnerable locations globally, and or here in the U.S. homeland. And Ted likely can speak to this a bit more. Iran still maintains links to other terrorist organizations, such as groups like Al Qaeda and its affiliates, that could conduct mass casualty attacks on civilians in the region, vulnerable locations globally, or here in the U.S. homeland. So, still considerable risks for the United States, Israel, and its other allies and partners to consider in formulating the options ahead.
Just a couple follow-ups here. Just on the when you think about the immediate future here, you were talking about some of the steps that might be required heading into any engagement regarding, say, personnel, American diplomatic personnel in the region, and other pre-positioning of things. In other words, is there? I mean, obviously, Iran, it's not you're not going to sneak up on them, so to speak, right? They know this is kind of a binary at this point. Either the U.S. is going to get involved or it's not. So, I mean, if the audience, if corporate America or market participants calls and says, "Hey, can I go to dinner tonight, or do I have to sit by the TV all night?" Like, are there signals that this is going to come before things go boom? That they should be on the lookout for, that will be in news media reports.
Yeah, I think among those indicators that I mentioned, in particular, the pre-positioning of U.S. assets, in particular, and the placement of the B-2 bomber in a close proximity would be a lead indicator that we are getting serious about that potential option. But these are well contemplated and thought through plans that have existed for some time, that the United States has worked through with the state of Israel and other allies and partners. So once a decision is made, it would be fairly seamless in terms of the steps that would flow from there. But again, I want to emphasize this carries high risk for the United States, and should capture all of our attention as a result.
And just to clarify here as well, because I think that there's some misperception in audiences sometimes watching television news on all of this, but you referred to the IMOP, the big giant bunker buster. I think sometimes there's a view that, you drop one of those things and it's like job done, go home. You're indicating that that is unlikely to be the case, given given how fortified Fordo is, and what the Canada. I know the United States Air Force has got experience with this. I believe Afghanistan is a theater where it's definitely been used. So, to some degree, although against targets not as hardened as this one, what it will do. But this will take time. In other words, to destroy effectively this facility.
That's right. And I know General Kelly will want to weigh in on this too from an operational perspective. But again, to emphasize, depending on what the U.S. and Israeli objectives are for Fordo, from an operational perspective, but also in the context of the broader nuclear negotiations, how severely damaged do we want Fordo to be? How far do we want to set back its operations? Is there a desire to allow Iran to have some enrichment capability on the other side as part of the negotiation process, or one of its outcomes? All of these factors matter in terms of the design of the operation, how much emphasis is placed on the use of the MOP, whether you need multiple MOPs, and what the mix of capabilities are going to be. To your point, there is an evidentiary base for what the MOP can do in practice, but this is a different target, very hardened underground. The effects of the debris, once there is a penetration, we would need to see the consequences of that and assess what the impacts are for the facility itself, and how does that then affect the need for follow-on operations and strikes. But I know General Kelly is going to have some great insights on this as well.
Yeah, so thank you. So General Kelly, for the benefit of our audience, General Kelly is joining us today while in transit, so he's sort of audio only, but we appreciate you joining today, sir. So maybe we could move to assume the green light. Assume this is going forward. Talk our audience through a little bit, then, and in the context of what Melissa was talking about, what that will look like, and what it will entail. Let's start with that.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the background offered by Ted and Melissa. Really good background. At the end of the day, what this will all lead to, and has already led to, is really, really high level discussions that calculate that the risk to not strike, i.e., a nuclear breakout, and the risk to a global population or regional population exceeds the risk to strike. And that would be the risk to force of our population and installations in the theater, whether it be in Qatar or embassy in Baghdad or bases like Al Assad, et cetera. And so that's the high level big quid and trade that is being discussed right now. When you look at, with respect to your question of, hey, the green light's been given, the thing, I'll get to your green light, but leading up to the green light, there's also been the discussion of, before we go kinetic, there's a huge amount of support that the U.S. can offer, and probably has offered it to some degree or another, non-kinetic. And that may be our capacity and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, our tanker fleet, our cyber. These are all capabilities that Israel has, but they don't have them near the capacity that the U.S. brings. And so it's a lot lower risk to retribution on the U.S. if we provide non-kinetic support. But again, and when you get to the kinetic side, Israel possesses many U.S. systems like F-16s and F-15s and F-35s and air defense, et cetera. And so, and they're obviously operating them in very high levels of proficiency and execution. But it really goes back to what, Ted and Melissa said. What they don't have is they don't have a 30,000-pound penetrating weapon. And that's the discussion that we lead to today. As far as if, quote unquote, the green light's given, there'll be a discussion of operations of quote unquote risk to force. Any force going in there, whether it be one aircraft or a big armada of aircraft, you'll still face a risk to force while the operation is going on. Not near what they would have faced 7 days ago because of the IADS takedown, the Integrated Air and Missile Defense System of the Iranians that the Israel's already taken down. But there still seems to be some residual risk that they will have to mitigate going in. And then post-strike, there'll be definite risk to the physical assets in the theater. Our bases, our installations across the region that are pretty well known. But as Melissa really covered well, and I won't talk so much about the 30,000-pound weapon, just to give people a context. If you take a penetrating weapon of any size, and usually our smallest penetrating weapon is usually a 2,000-pound class weapon, and the challenge you have in any penetrating weapon is twofold. It runs out of kinetics, i.e. bumps into too much steel or concrete, and doesn't get to the target you need to get to, or the pressures on the external case crush the fuse before it can set off the charge. And so during that drop, should we go ahead and green light and drop a 30,000-pound weapon, there'll be definitely an assessment of how well the first one or how well the first two did. When you drop a 2,000-pound weapon, if you drop two in very close succession, it has almost the same effect as a 5,000-pound weapon. It is kind of referred to as a double tap. And there's a benefit by putting one in trail of the other. I'm not smart enough to know the weapons effects and the objectives they have of Fodor and how well they want to dig, if they want to damage, or how much they want to get near that refined fuel. But that's just a little bit of context to how these weapons are used. And the effect of two in close succession, or how much assessment they'll do by air sampling before they go in with their follow-on strike. Over.
And so, yeah, so to the point, if I'm hearing you correctly, given that one of the concerns we have is what the Iranian retaliation will be, and so on and so forth, that it takes time, I guess, right? It takes time for you to drop the whatever ordinance you do on this site. That creates a lot of dust and debris and so on and so forth. So you got to wait for the dust to settle a little bit, no, to have the satellites take a look, have whatever human intelligence is there take a look, get the signals intelligence, to kind of get a sense of what was accomplished, and then what you have to go back for, and then go back for again, and so on and so forth. I mean, are there delays in all of this? Meaning, should the audience be expecting that it would take, if the objective is indeed to destroy this site, or attrit it, to, I know Melissa talked about not going all the way necessary for diplomatic purposes, but to get the job done, essentially, this will take some time.
Yeah, that's accurate. And so the imaging will take place almost instantaneously, because the Middle East for years has been the most imaged piece of real estate on the planet because of our operations there. The assessment could take a little bit longer because it takes really smart people in our different three-letter intelligence apparatus to assess what has happened and what has not happened. It's tough to see when you're digging a hole. It's tough to see what you've struck or what you've not struck. The other thing is, just like systems across the globe measure air sampling. So, say, for example, when the Chernobyl disaster happened, there's air sampling that takes place to ascertain what has been exposed to the atmosphere, what is not. And so, there's a little bit of time, but I would say the imaging is not the biggest time. It's the assessment that will be the biggest time. That could be hours, it could be a couple of days.
So can I ask a question of all three of you here? On, maybe this is a dumb question, but I mean, you sort of alluded to it there for a moment ago, which is, if you're dropping ordnance of this magnitude on this site with all of this, with all of this enriched uranium there and the like, even if it hasn't been turned into the actual metal to be put into a warhead, I mean, can can you create inadvertently a giant dirty bomb here? I mean, will there be a giant plume of radioactive material that could blow around all over the region, or is that an exaggerated risk?
I'll take a first swing at this, guys. That first of all, I'm not a nuclear scientist, and of the many covers I used over the years, one was not a nuclear scientist. Complicated stuff. But let me say this: this is a point in time, and this is a target, and this is an event for which decades of discussion have already taken place, where the full sort of unblinking eye of Israeli and U.S. intelligence agencies and other partners have been focused on this. As General Kelly said, it's the most sort of probably photographed place on the planet Earth. So as we speak, I'll give you a sort of maybe a peek behind the curtain. The number of people in our U.S. military, in our Department of Energy, in our Department of Defense, who are modeling these things, coming up with best case, worst case scenarios. And if they lack the expertise, and believe me, there's a lot of expertise, we will reach out to whomever we need to come up with the best sort of modeling to come up with those risks to life and limb from possible, radiation exposure or something akin to a dirty bomb. There'll also be planning upon planning upon planning of what to do with that site post facto to make sure that the Iranians or whomever aren't collecting what is potentially about to be bombed. So I can tell you, Kevin, the unblinking eye of the U.S. government. This is a time you and your clients, all of us. This is a time people should be proud because there are a lot of big brains and a lot of eyes on this target.
Melissa and General Kelly, are you confident that if and again, we're making it a sort of an assumption of what the actual mission is here, right? To destroy this facility. I mean, if that is the mission, I mean, is that something that can be accomplished solely from the air? I think Melissa, you talked about this a little bit in your opening remarks, but I mean, does this require on the ground support in some way, shape, or form?
It really does hinge on how expansive the set of objectives are for this mission. To keep coming back to that point, again, if we're looking to degrade and set back to a certain degree, Gordo, there are certainly things that you can do from the air that we've talked about. If you want to be more damaging and debilitating from a longer term perspective, that's going to require a combination of tools that could include cyber, it could include other non-kinetics. It might require presence on the ground to achieve those effects. And then there's the aftermath, as General Kelly and as they were talked about in terms of how will we verify what actually has been damaged? How does that plug into the ongoing nuclear negotiations? How does that plug into the inspections that are on at least now is still committed to proceeding on that? That is a lever that they could pull coming out of this in retribution is to not be open to inspections going forward. It's important to keep in mind as well. But there'll be that aspect too in terms of assessing the implications of how much damage has been affected that needs to be calculated on the front end in terms of what tools the United States and Israel are employing. If we want to have a good sight picture of how much damage has been accomplished, we need to structure the attack in such a way that that'll actually be visible and evidence can be collected.
And for you and General Kelly, Melissa, presumably as when you were in the building, the Pentagon, I mean, you're very focused on having an achievable objective and then go out and do it essentially. And that's and your capabilities are almost limitless if you've got an objective. It is quite clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu has expanded the potential mission for Israel to include regime change, if you will. And that involves some real mission creep. Now, there's question always of, obviously these things can sort of blend together over time, but when you start hearing that, does that give Pentagon leadership pause? I mean, obviously, regime change has not been something that is easily accomplished. We learned that in Iraq. Russia is learning that in Ukraine right now. Is that a real concern here from a military operational perspective?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that from a defense policy perspective and strategic perspective and hand it over to General Kelly. Certainly, if that was introduced as part of the U.S. government's conversations in terms of the objectives, and or if the partner we're working with, in this case Israel, has more expansive objectives than the United States is comfortable with, we would certainly need to think through the implications of that. And being very clear-eyed about the fact that the military instrument only gets you so far in furthering regime change objectives, because we have to think about the aftermath. Who picks up the pieces in Iran? What are the other tools at the United States and the region's disposal to navigate the path coming out of that? And what are the follow-on implications for the U.S. military that will still be in the region operating and potentially quite vulnerable in the aftermath? And I do think there's quite a lot of scar tissue, as you alluded to, in terms of the U.S. track record and being able to have a comprehensive approach to those types of questions. But let me hand it over to Gerald Cullen.
Yeah, I think Kevin, Melissa covered the policy piece with respect to regime change and some lessons we've learned out of that. And so I don't think I'll wade into the policy piece, but I think she covered it so well. I will revisit real quick your question on can the corridor be mitigated from the air only, and she covered also that really well. And I would focus on the area of verification. The air piece is a very, very blunt, it's precise, but it's a very, very blunt instrument. And so if you kind of look back at our national challenges, and I'll just pick one, Osama bin Laden, that strike in Abbottabad, that solution could have been 100% handled from the air. The challenge is you would have had almost an impossible task to verify, that Osama bin Laden was gone. That's not really 100% great analogy compared to this problem, but it's comparable in the sense of you can solve this greatly from the air with heavy kinetics. But the challenge is the verification and the assessment of the forensics. And I think that's where Melissa's kind of scratching it really well about. And there's nothing better than eyes on, except lots of eyes on.
Yeah, thank you. I want to sort of close out here and bring the conversation back to you, Ted. And I apologize to all of you while we're talking about this deathly serious situation. There is a rock band on Park Avenue as we speak, the perils of live television. So I'm sorry for the outside noise, but Ted, I guess my question for you is what your concerns are about Iran's response to all of this. It seems to me that one of the reasons put forward by Prime Minister Netanyahu about the existential nature of this threat isn't just that a country has nuclear weapons. Many countries have nuclear weapons. Most of them have them with the intent to deter, to be left alone, and not to commit suicide. Even even North Korea, for that matter. But there seems to be the view that there's something different about the Iranian theocratic regime. And the potential, for martyrdom, et cetera. In other words, if they had the weapon, might be inclined to cross that final taboo and use it. So the question I've got is, that presumably means that all other options that they could bring to the table are also, game for them, particularly if they feel that they are under existential threats, especially the supreme leader himself. And so question is how you kind of assess that retaliatory spectrum to be, and whether there is a risk that even if they haven't um, enriched the uranium to weapons grade 90% plus, whatever, that they could still create crude weapons that could create an awful lot of damage, not to mention societal panic in an important commercial economic region of the world. Um, how do you see that?
When they are at the point of it's the regime's existence is in peril and in jeopardy, whether it is an outright decision by Israel right now or something joint with the United States to move into that decapitation or regime change area. They have a variety of tools at their hand that I could quickly enumerate. I would say, remember, I think early on, the first night of this campaign by Israel, they probably could have effectively taken out the Ayatollah himself, and they didn't. It's probably a lot harder to do now. The Ayatollah is probably in a bunker somewhere that didn't protect Nasrallah in Lebanon, but it certainly was a lesson for the Ayatollah. So right now, I'm not sure that Israel's moved into that space of decapitating the religious or political leadership or regime change, as you said, but TBD. But at that point, when Iran decides or determines or assesses that its regime's in peril, let me just tick off a few facts and figures. Hezbollah may very well have been degraded severely, but this has also been a worldwide or a regional threat. So their ability to conduct asymmetrical attacks, otherwise known as terrorism, in the region, I wouldn't discount that there are some on the shelf cells or capabilities still out there. Second, I think Melissa already alluded to this, but we have the Houthis and their de facto relationship with Al Qaeda and Shabab in Somalia, meaning the Houthis right now have remained quiet. My guess is the word went out from Tehran. Let's keep things quiet until we determine whether the U.S. joins this fray or not. But the Houthis can bring some havoc into the Red Sea, continue to slow down trade and commerce through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal. And they also do have sort of a enemy of my enemy's relationship with Al Qaeda and with Al Shabaab in Somalia. And I'll remind folks, right now they've adhered to their truce with Saudi Arabia. But if the gloves are off for the Iranian regime and this continues sort of down a path of let's mop up the whole axis of resistance, I could see the Houthis joining this fray and perhaps giving a nudge to the Al Qaeda folks who are basically on the border of Saudi Arabia to sort of restart their activities. And those were some dangerous Al Qaeda folks at one point in time. Iraqi militias also probably got the message, let's be quiet. But I'll remind folks, we have a presence there in a big embassy. They drew down. A lot of folks went home and they make preparations. But that's a danger. Think 1979 Iran Revolution hostages. We got to think about those things. Shutting down the Hormuz, stymieing oil exports by Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. It's in the Iranian capability. I haven't read much about Israeli strikes against Iranian naval vessels, etc. But that's a trick still up the Iranian sleeve. And I would say, remember too, besides our embassies, we have somewhere about 40,000 forces in the region. 5 bases in Kuwait. We got NAVCENT Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. We have Al Udeid in Qatar, and then a variety of other smaller locations where U.S. military personnel are working collaboratively with host nations. Those are potentially vulnerable targets to some of these asymmetrical attacks. that so far we haven't seen the Iranians or the axis of resistance. They've been quiet of late, but those are targets that are in Gulf countries that if the U.S. is involved, in some ways might, by extension, involve those Gulf nations that are hosts. And those Gulf nations aren't necessarily as prepared or hardened, obviously, as Tel Aviv, which is thousands of miles away, nor our own forces, which have force protection capabilities. So the Gulfies are kind of the soft underbelly, if you will, of this and potentially collateral damage if and when U.S. gets involved in this current war between Iran and Israel.
And we have seen both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates targeted in the past of the previous Biden and Trump one administrations. Well, there you have it. We will continue to follow the developments here. We'll probably gather this and other guests as events warrant over the next several days. But until such time, I want to thank General Mark Kelly and Melissa Dalton and Ted Singer for joining me today. If this conversation prompts any further questions, or if you have would need to discuss with us further, please don't hesitate to reach out to your Teneo contacts or reach out to us directly at Teneo Insights at Teneo.com. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Thanks and have a great day.